ที่ยังไม่ได้แนะนำอยู่วงนอกไหมคะแนะนำตัวหน่อยไหมคะอาจารย์ขาใช่ไหมวงนอกค่ะ
Good afternoon. My name is Sumanon. I'm a PhD student from the agricultural faculty, and I study on the gene expression in livestock animal.
Good afternoon. My name is Nathaya Donghakklang. I'm PhD student from Animal Science, Department of Animal Science from Agriculture Faculty, and we are represent from Animal Genomic Laboratory from Professor Dr. Monchai Dongchinda.
Good afternoon. My name is Panwat Kampilawat. I'm a PhD student at this lab, Animal Genetic Unit Laboratory. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Paput Jalern Apiban. I'm a faculty member in the Faculty of Engineering, KKU.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Thana Lapakdi. I'm a member of Faculty of Engineering, and I also work with Research University Network. And actually, my background is control engineer. Thank you.
อาจารย์คู่ต้องแนะนำตัวหน่อยไหมทรายพาร์คน่ะ อยู่ข้างหลังกับอาจารย์จับอ่ะ ผู้อะไรนะผู้ดูแลหลัก
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Thilawat. Now I'm two the position right now in Khon Kaen University. First one is the faculty members of the Faculty of Engineering. Another one is the assistant director for the Khon Kaen Science Park. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Sapilachai Wongsiwapon. I'm Deputy Director, Khon Kaen University Science Park, and I prepared this section. And I would like to introduce my team for this section. คุณ นพดล น้องแก้วอินไทย คุณพรชรัตน์น้องต่ออินไทย คุณรัตนศักดิ์ and แขกน้องแขกน้องออนนะฮะแล้วก็แอนthey are Science Park Khon Kaen University. Thank you.
ขอบคุณค่ะทรายพาร์คเรื่องเหลือใครอีกไหมคะไม่เหลือแล้วใช่ไหมคะห้องนี้แนะนำตัวกันบอกว่า I think we can open for discussion that อาจารย์ขาถ้าอยากจะคิดว่าเปิด floor for discussion ดีไหมคะเผื่อจะได้แลกเปลี่ยนหรือว่าถามกันอะไรอย่างนี้นะคะแล้วถ้าอาจารย์เคนลงมาเมื่อไหร่ I think what happened Okay so why don't we open the floor for discussion ดีไหมคะถ้าเกิดท่านไหนมองว่าตรงไหนที่จะเป็น point ที่จะแลกเปลี่ยนกันเองนะ I think the discussion can be among us not only that from us to the speakers but also among us and also the speaker can give some inputs or if any of us have some particular questions that we would like to ask the speakers to share with us please feel free to do so I think or for some of the students if you have some question that you would like to ask and if you need my help to translate my poor English to you that you can understand then I can help the student what do you think
Yes, and we also want to learn from you. One of the deliverables that we want to have by the end of this session is maybe a white paper describing the environment in Thailand and how can we move innovation and entrepreneurship in science at Khon Kaen University as well as in the Northeast region. So we would love to learn what you perceived as obstacles, what you think are the advantages of the region so that together we could actually write a paper and hopefully plan a roadmap ahead. I wasn't here for James' presentation, but some of the things that I would like to describe as what we have at MIT is that there's a very strong industry presence at MIT. Like you could never get away from industry. I work in a lab at the Institute for Medical Engineering and Science, and half of our funding comes from industry. So we're able to hire people from investments from the companies in the Cambridge area. The other thing that's very popular as well at MIT would be internships. So every student would have an internship during the summer, during the winter, to the companies that are not just at Cambridge but all over the United States. And in return, for example, in our lab, we would have engineers from industry spending a few months with us so that they become aware of what are the research topics that are hot at MIT. In exchange, they give us some gifts or some research funding for those opportunities.
So Ajahn Ken is here with us. Ajahn Ken, can you stand up and we welcome Ajahn Ken นะคะค่ะ May I give a brief introduction about Ajahn Ken นะคะ Dr. Kenneth Pack how to pronounce Pack okay Ken นะคะ Ajahn Ken ค่ะ Kenneth Pack is a clinical information he is a clinical informatician okay driving quality improvement and democratizing access through technology innovation, combining a multidisciplinary background in medicine. So he's a medical doctor. You are a medical doctor, Ken. Yeah. And artificial intelligence. Business management, he has also MBA and MMSc. And technology strategy. As a research scientist at the MIT Laboratory for Computational Physiology, he is investigating the secondary analysis of health data and building intelligent decision support systems. He is also the co-director of MIT Sana Group, where he leads capacity building programs and research projects, driving quality improvement through digital technologies in health. So please welcome Dr. Ken. Thank you for coming. Jem gave some introduction about what you are doing there at MIT, and we have each of our participants to introduce themselves. Where are they from? From my conclusion is like one side is more like company, another side is more like research ใช่ไหมคะ and academic ใช่ไหมคะ So I think each of you can share or any of you would like to discuss or ask or talk to each other. I open the floor. Or do you like to say hi? Just.
Good afternoon. I think it's great that you're bringing together industry with academics. This is I think it's mutually beneficial for us to work together and collaborate. And we see it through, Leo and I, we both work at LCP and Sana, and we see it mutually, we have mutual beneficial cooperations with industry, focusing on our research. And while we focus a lot on open science and open source software, I think that, I hope, if you're not familiar with those terms, that's okay. If you are familiar with them, I know that a lot of industry people have a tendency to shy away and are afraid of those terms, but don't be afraid. I think those are, it's more about knowledge sharing and validation rather than trying to be socialist or communist. We are all about making things profitable and making money, and keeping these initiatives sustainable is the big reason that we're focusing on. So we have ongoing partnerships with industry through our LCP with the data analytics, and we look forward to having this discussion about how to build these bridges between industry and academia.
เรียนเชิญเลยนะคะมอบไมโครโฟนให้ค่ะจะมีใครดิสคัสค่ะเชิญค่ะอาจารย์ขา
As I come from industry, of private sector. Actually, I'm a veterinarian by academic background, but I shift to management after I finished my MBA program 12 years ago. My company, Better Girl Group, we have an integrative operation from upstream to downstream. And finally, we produce food for human consumption, actually. For 11 years already, that Better Girl have set up Research and Development Center at Thailand Science Park. We are close to NASDA, National Science Technology Development Agency under the Ministry of Science Technology. I think the lesson learned on the information shared by James at MIT is very common for Thailand's context. I learned for 10 or 11 years that in Thailand, not only we lack of communication between academia, industry, or government, we have a miscommunication started from a different mindset of the person in academia, in the government, and in private sector. But right now, actually in Thailand, it's going, improvement in terms of communication, and we understand each other more. One question for MIT: how long after MIT found the problems and you have solution and you have a course of action, how long that you take to change the cultures in MIT?
Yeah, it takes a long time, I think. But I would say, for example, the MIT Biotech Group has only been in existence for 2 years, and we've had, I think the culture, some subset of the culture of the people at MIT, the culture has already changed. There's definitely companies that have been created because we've provided access to connections and to capital. And I think what needs to happen for the culture to continue to change is for this type of thinking to become ubiquitous. So for students and professors and entrepreneurs and industry people to accept this communication, the idea that people can get involved in these different areas simultaneously, and that the barriers between them can kind of be reduced, just taken for granted, you know? And this happens in, I don't know if this answers your question, but as an analogy, so I work in the computer science and artificial intelligence lab, as do I think both Ken and Leo. And if you look 50 years ago, the culture was very different than the culture is now. So 50 years ago, if I talked to professors and people who have been in the lab for a long time, if you were say you were a top student, right? If you were an A+ student, you would go to a big prestigious company. That was the best possible job you could have because it was prestigious and it was safe, right? And if you were a lower tier student, maybe like a B or a C student, then you would go and try and start a company, or you would join a startup. Now the situation is entirely the opposite. So if you are, the top students at MIT who don't go on to graduate school, they start their own companies. And many of them are starting companies or joining startups before they even graduate. And that's viewed as like the best thing to be doing if you are an extremely talented person. And if you're, more of a B or C student, then you tend to go to the bigger companies. So I think that is evidence of the fact that, within that it took a couple decades, I guess, but I think it's evidence that it can happen, and that there's significant return on changing that culture. Because CSAIL, the Artificial Intelligence Lab, has launched many successful companies and has very successful partnerships with industry as a result. So.
I just turned it on. Okay, I just turned it on. Your question is a challenging one, and we don't really know what the answer is, and it kind of breaks it down into two parts. Number one, when you identify the problem, how do you get to the next stage? And identifying the problem can sometimes be the easy part, but the timing to the next stage of actually implementing a solution, especially institutionally, requires luck and timing and momentum and institutional commitment. If we're just an individual, even at a faculty level, at a high level faculty member level, if you don't have institutional support, you're not going to be able to impact a change without the rest of the organization buying into it. So that timing is very difficult to determine, regardless of how important the problem is. But once you get that institutional buy-in, things can move very quickly, obviously, or as quickly as academia can move. I like to highlight James's success for his organization and how it happened. And his success came about outside of faculty support. And if actually being a student-driven initiative is how they succeeded and were able to push and the immovable object of the bureaucracy at MIT. Because ultimately, while MIT is there to be a beneficial vehicle for their students, and their students are basically their primary asset. As much as we think the professors are what the strength of MIT is, it's actually their students. So if you get enough momentum from the students, you can actually drive a lot of institutional change that way. Otherwise, get connections at the highest levels, the provost, the president, and if they're on board, then you can drive the organizational change.
I would like to ask your suggestions on the MIT Alumni Angel Group. Which kind of organization are you establishing? Is the group would be social enterprise or the educational promoting agency?
Thank you. Yeah, so it's interesting because Ken is exactly right in the fact that if you try and get approval and officially proceed with a lot of these things, it can take forever. So one of the problems with the MIT Alumni Angel Group that we had, even though we had buy-in from the president and from other people who were very high up at MIT, was that they didn't want to associate the MIT name with an investment vehicle, right? And I think that's actually that's a very important thing to think about when you're talking. I mean, it's perhaps the most critical thing that we've experienced in between academia and industry is finding where you separate the line. So MIT was not willing to say this is a MIT-sponsored investment vehicle because they felt like that was a conflict of interest. So we actually don't have. So many angel groups have a single fund, and the angels will invest in the fund, and then the fund invests in the startups. We don't do any of that. All we do is we find, we have about 100 or 120 angels. We find companies through our own personal connections at MIT, and then we just hold an event kind of like this where we have food, we have the companies present, and then we let the angels and the companies meet each other. And then if the angels are interested, we'll organize a, like a presentation online or something like this. But we don't do anything officially. We just leave that up to the angels and to the startups to figure out for themselves.
What are the most difficulties to establish this group as early stage, such as environment or in terms of awareness and funding? Could you please suggest us?
Well, what is the most difficult part of it?
Yes.
Or, well, so we don't have, the funding that we have is through either through the MIT Biotech Group, so the funding either comes from MIT, and all we do is buy food, so it's not very expensive. Or it comes from local venture capital firms, which are willing to fund, they'll buy pizza or something, and in exchange for having their name on one of the slides. So that actually wasn't very hard. It was pretty easy to get that. And then the hardest part was just finding finding the alumni and the entrepreneurs. But then again, that really wasn't that hard either. I found that the alumni were extremely interested and excited about this, and then the entrepreneurs were also very interested and excited, especially because they shared the MIT connection, which is the same thing I think any university. People feel attached to the university, and the level of people that we got. I mean, we have CEOs of companies that have tens of thousands of employees that come and sit and then invest in these startups. So it just kind of happened naturally once we created the framework.
Yes. May I ask the question? Maybe Leo or Ken or James answer this question. And my question is the gaps between the researcher and the industry is how to make the research output transfer to the industry, because the researcher have their own patent or their work, but they don't know how to launch this to the industry. In terms of university may match between the industry and the researcher, but there may be some of potential works that can be launched, but some might not. So I think that the first key success factor is how to make this and left no one behind, and how to make a research that can be transformed or translated to the industry. And this is the first point. And the second one is for the example of the James that give maybe 3 or 4 activities. Which activity is the first factor? Or you just doing all the activity at the same times? Or maybe some activity is at the upstream or downstream? We have 2 questions.
So I'm going to address the first. How do you bridge the gap between research and industry? And as I mentioned earlier, industry has a very strong presence at MIT. And when I say strong presence, they're actually physically present at MIT. So our group gets a lot of funding from Philips Healthcare. And so they come to our lab, and our members also go to Philips Healthcare, which just moved to Cambridge. But they gave MIT around $25 million over 5 years as an investment. And the objective of that investment is to bridge the gap between Philips Healthcare and MIT. I was able to obtain funding so our lab is focused on health data analytics. And one of the biggest barriers that we feel is a big hindrance to moving that area forward is the fact that the data scientists are not really working together with the clinicians. So I went to Philips Healthcare and I told them that we need to buy clinicians so that we could free them from the hospital and they could spend time here at MIT and at Philips Healthcare. And I was able to get that funding. So every year we buy 2 clinicians, half of their time, so that they come to MIT, they come to Philips Healthcare. We're more exposed to how clinicians think, what are the problems that they face in day-to-day practice. And they also get an engineering perspective, a data science perspective to the issues that they have. So when I say bridging the gap, it's really immersion. Somehow the Philips people are coming to MIT. So this past fall, we started a course on secondary analysis of electronic health records. We had 50 students. 10 of those were engineers from Philips Healthcare. And they were coming to our course every Friday. And now you have established very close links between people in our lab, doctors from the Harvard hospitals, and engineers from Philips Healthcare. And we're continuing on with projects that we have thought about during the course. So to us, those are very crucial ingredients. If you're going to have ties, it just shouldn't be on paper. There has to be physical presence of the members of one group going to the facilities of the industry and vice versa. And I'll have them address the other questions.
Actually, before handing off to James, I'll add on to Leo's discussion that there is the high-level caveat that you need to be careful of conflicts of interest, and as researchers for basic science, we have to be very careful that we don't get too influenced by industry, but obviously we rely heavily on industry to support research. And researchers should maintain an independence in where they pursue their research and the things that they spend time on. And obviously, by having a strong relationship and presence, we can have discussions, and that's. But especially at MIT and places where we do basic science, especially in medicine, having the independence is very important, for society at large. So it's a long-term commitment, and without a direct tie to return, where you need to invest as industry, as private industry, you need to invest both money and time and human resources to facilitate the exchange of knowledge. It's not just about giving money and expecting a patent back. You need to send your team members to the academic institution, because they're going to be focusing on the science portion of it, but your team members have to be sure that they understand what the science is and figure out how to apply that to your specific industry and have that continued discussion. So, I think the independence of the researchers is important to maintain their credibility of the science and be able to publish and get the necessary credibility in the science academia. So that's something to keep in mind.
So your question was, what did we start doing? And then is that right? Yeah, so the first thing that we did, at first we didn't think we were going to become this big. We were just students that were interested in industry and wanted to help ourselves by creating organizations that would allow us to connect with leaders in industry. So to that end, the first thing we did was start a seminar series. And our seminar series was simply once a week, roughly. We would, actually at first it was like once a month because nobody cared about us. And we would invite people to come who were, very well known in industry, and then we just invite students to come, and then they'd give talks, and that was the first thing that we did, and that lasted for a while. And then once we started getting more recognition and we got more people involved, the interest from the student level, the resources we had available at MIT, and the industry interest all expanded very quickly. And then we had opportunities to launch other things that addressed other kind of pain points that we had identified. So the first thing was just creating a seminar series where people met each other, and then it kind of naturally grew from there.
Okay, first of all, I have to thanks to James that you have mentioned something which is very interesting. And actually my question would, you have to answer on what actually you have done the conclusion on the culture can be engineered. Okay, but before you answer the questions, let me put my story just in maybe 1 minute, okay, to make you understand the main problem lies behind the culture. I am one person who admit that I actually works in my company before. I am an industry man like Kun Ruchivet, okay, and I have so many companies of mine. In the past, I do research, okay. I try to gain funding from organizations like Science Park or the NASDA, okay. Then I was employed as the expertise who helped to listen to what actually the industrial problems are, and I try to solve them by problem identifying. And we try to put up some solution design, okay, before we execute it. With that, it's not always important that every problem can be solved, first of all. Then I try to identify the main root of the problem. This is my personal feeling. I always see SME. I don't know whether in your country they call SME, but it's a small, medium business or enterprise that they try to create some projects of themselves. And many of them, we have seen that failures do occur because they are not well trained from child. That's why I have my passion. I moved on to academics, and now I'm in the Assumption University. The Assumption University is one of the private university, number one private university. I mean, in the if let's say we would round up all the university, they would rank 7 in Thailand. But for the private one, they rank number 1. Most of the people, including Kun Ruchiwet, mentioned to me earlier before we come to the discussion, Assumption University always produce the most excellent students to become the MBA students. They are like CEOs or vice president in most of the industry in Thailand. But what lies and fail behind that, only 1 or 2 of them will just reach that extent. The rest of them don't go to the extent. What I did is that in December, I and Dr. Apirachai, okay, we tried to bring up something called MOU signing. And I see that his idea is correct, although some of the expertise or Ajahn in Thailand would say that incubator won't help. Startup fail. But I believe, I am one person who believes that if you incubate those students before they actually exit from the universities, and they try to pick up some knowledge on what is actually entrepreneurship is, and they try to be a good incubator. I signed with Dr. Apirachai because he could give funding. I would sign with another person who could give some expertise or helps. But the problem lies in that I always feel that every time when I work with them, another problem occurs, which is the culture. My question to you is that always halfway, the difference between the culture, the organizational culture between them, always have some breakdown. And this is my personal feeling that always there are something to be break down by culture. And you say that culture can be engineered. So my question is that how do you exercise your culture to be engineered?
So how do you exercise it in what sense? What is be a little...
Maybe let's put it in a management way to make the project leads towards the end and give it a success one. Okay, and we minimize the risk of failure.
Okay. So the question is, how can you take kind of the culture that you want to engineer and kind of break down the current culture that exists and mold it into the other thing that you're thinking about? Yeah. So I think it's a deep question, and there's a lot of like sociological and like there's a lot of psychological factors that go into this. But if I was just going to say a blanket statement, I would say if you create opportunities, for example, like you mentioned the MBAs, right? If you create opportunities for the top students to be more successful in some way, doing something that you want them to do, then they're going to naturally do that thing, I think, especially if you mention it and make it kind of like a prestigious, valued thing. So I think if you, and one example of this is so I can talk a little bit about, so I actually worked in finance before I went into science, and in the shift in the people that go to finance is very interesting. It used to be the kind of very, top of the class would go into finance, whether you were an MBA or an engineer, you could, and then now there's the shift where a lot of people are kind of dismissing that and going into entrepreneurship. And I think the reason is, one, it's become like a cool thing to do. There's a lot of celebrated people who are successful in these areas that we talk about. We talk about like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and Bill Gates, and people hear these things and they think that's great, I'd like to do that. But then also because they can make more money sometimes doing that, right? They can make more money by starting a company. Maybe there's a different, so it depends on the risk profile of people. And I think when you I'm not sure if this answers your question or not, but I think when you create those opportunities, people will naturally tend towards them. Is that?
Okay, maybe I put my question in the better way. Okay, let's say opportunity doesn't come in culture sometimes. That's what my belief. Let's say I give a case example. When I say that opportunity don't come in culture most of the time because sometimes only one opportunity is created. Let's say if he doesn't know who you are and you doesn't know who he is, and actually if there are a person, organization like Science Park or me who can actually match them together, but they both have different culture. Let's say an entrepreneur or incubator wants to just start up his or her dream to become a successful businessman, seeing Steve Jobs as a role model. But always, sometimes when he start doing his research, he fail. Okay, the opportunity just came once that maybe Science Park or maybe Assumption University give funding to him. Okay, try to bring him up, but there is no second chance. So this kind of way is, this is a kind of like cultural barrier that always sometimes the risk taking only prevent him from growing further.
So you're saying the problem is that there's a culture of once you fail, you've failed.
One thing that I don't know whether you have understood rightly, in your countries, might have a different culture. But whereas in Asian or ASEAN countries, they do have very strong culture on seniority. They do have a strong culture on like preventing somebody to be just more smarter than them. That's why you mentioned always the big connection or someone who has a strong support will just get the credit. With the rest, they won't be.
Yeah, I think that's. I don't know if you guys have a thought on that, but I think it's a very important question, and I think one of the reasons that if you look at like Silicon Valley, for example, having started a company and then failing is actually viewed as a positive attribute because you've had experience in failure, I guess. And I think that's something that does not, that's interesting to hear that that's not the case in Thailand. And I think that's also not the case in other places that I've heard about, including like, for example, Korea. But I'm not positive, but I think that's a very good point.
I think there's obviously there's a distinction between societal culture, society at large, so Thai culture, U.S. culture, Filipino culture, and that type of culture, and versus business culture. I think originally it was touching on your company culture and how that can actually change. And the bottom line is, talking about from an MBA perspective, culture is one of the hardest things to change, right? Because it's ingrained, and ultimately, but it is shown that culture can be engineered, but ultimately it comes from the people that you have. So if you're gonna try and engineer a culture, you have to change the people. Either select for the specific type of people, and you can change other people, but they can't. You can start from a specific culture and change that culture. If somebody comes from a specific culture, they can go to a new culture and change and become part of that culture. But it's difficult to change an entire group of people to a new culture. You have to pre-select a lot of people into that organization so they overtake the majority and start being the influence of the mindset to ultimately come to that new evolution. So even from a science perspective, if you have time for an anecdote, I don't know how much time we have. No, I will skip this anecdote. If you want to hear the monkey anecdote, I can tell it to you later. Anyways, the point is, it can be engineered. Culture is incredibly difficult to change, but it has to come from the people. You can't just set up rules and guidelines in order to do it.
May I add some idea with him that in Thailand culture we better call that we don't only know how, but we have to know who. That is our culture. So you mean that if when we set up or we implement any proposal, we have to know who. If you don't know who, you cannot get any approval. This is our culture that I would like to share. Yeah, it's not like in US. And the second thing is I would like to ask to share idea with Dr. Leo about the how to do the business in northeastern region, because mostly our company is the SME, because we have about 98% is the SME, and mostly we are based on cultural product, just like rice, sugar cane, tapioca, and also the chicken. So this is our basic of northeastern, because this region in the 20 or 30 years ago, this region is very poor, very poor. So we are now developed. So we have some the original route that our idea is most of our people think about how to get money from the money from the government. So we don't have any time to think about ourselves. So it means that when we do business, it's the same also. We don't think, we just copy, and also we make a lot of OEM. As you know, OEM, we make by as the other brand name, just like we make the Nike, we make the Adidas, we produce here. As you wear shirt or something, Nike, Adidas, Dr. Martin, we are produced here. We call OEM. So that means that the problem is that our SME, the government policy would like us or encourage us to have more innovative, but we cannot create more innovative. So I think that's the problem is how we can encourage people to make more innovative. The second thing is that, as Mr. James said, it's a problem of bureaucracy, as I told you. And the third is the researcher. Because my business, my private business, I have the problem with many researchers, because when we have the research and talking with the researchers, most of researchers in the university don't have time. They have to teach, they have to make the research. So it's the problem that because our researcher, the income is not too high, or it's not much to for feed his or her life. So I think that the problem is not like in US, because researchers, so we have to collect all the culture in the university, as I see, as I am the outsider. So I think that many things have to change, so we can cope with the demand or the need of the innovation. Yeah.
The culture of innovation is difficult, especially if your culture already prevents it. So as you were saying, it's about who you know rather than actually whether you can execute. So because of that initial barrier, it has to come from the top. The top has to, the people in power, the people with money, have to want to drive that innovation and allow it to happen. They have to be willing to give up power and give up money and give other people opportunities. The young people, the not so young people, give other people that have the ideas, the innovation initiatives to actually, one thing that James says, having the incentives aligned, right? So you have to give them incentive in order to drive the innovation. They have to be given the chance to get money, to make money from their innovation. Otherwise, if it's just tied to your job, you're just going to continue the same procedure over and over again. You have no incentive to take risk unless you can make more money. And on the other hand, you also have to, from the bottom up, you have to give them the opportunity to fail, right? Because why take the risk to do an innovation when you can just stay in your same company for the next 20 years, make a safe salary, save money for your family, right? So it comes on both ends. They have to have an incentive, a financial incentive to take that risk for the innovation, and also be okay with taking a risk of failure, have a little of a safety net in case they do fail, because 95% of startups do fail after 3 years. So it's a high risk, high payoff venture, and to change that culture overnight, it's very difficult to do that. It seems very dangerous or risky for most people, and it could either, you know, it can happen. It can happen seemingly overnight if you have a young generation that's very risk taking. They're not risk adverse and they can just suddenly spring up overnight. But to have it come over from the top down is very difficult to institute.
Yeah, I agree, and I would say just very quickly. I think one thing that is interesting. So first of all, it's very interesting for me to hear about the situation in Thailand. So thank you for sharing that with me. Yeah, I find that extremely interesting. I think one of the things in terms of changing the culture, especially that you mentioned in a specific company, you know, one of the reasons why we're talking about changing the culture like this to increase innovation is because I believe, and I think evidence has shown, that it is more successful at creating innovation and thus more successful at creating wealth, right? So if you have your own company and you're able to change the culture within your own company, which you have control over, like Ken said, because you can decide who works there and what the incentive structure is, then the implication is that your company will outperform because the people in your company will outperform. And as a very quick case study, there's a company that I think is very interesting that is founded by 3 people from Brazil. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's called 3G Capital. Yeah, and so 3G Capital is very interesting because they're a private equity company. They initially were an investment bank, and they grew. I mean, within one generation, they became this enormous. They own, I think now, Burger King. They own Heinz. They own Kraft. They own InBev. They're an enormous company, and the way that they've grown like this is by implementing in my opinion, a new culture that was focused on. They would hire the smartest people they could find, but also the most driven people they could find, and they wouldn't pay them the salary that you typically would get in investment banking. They'd pay them a much lower salary, but they'd give them a chance within a few years to become a partner in the organization, and they'd give them a lot of equity. So the people who came into the company weren't making much money, but if they did a great job and if they worked very hard, many of them became very wealthy. And that company, as a result, has overpowered all the other I would say culturally inferior companies. So yeah.
Just a very quick addition. One phrase that has been used over and over again is that culture changes one funeral at a time, which means that the older people who have made sure that the culture doesn't change, eventually would die, and they will be replaced by younger people. So our advice is always start targeting the younger people, the ones who are still in school, and making sure that they understand why the culture needs to change, so that when they take over the leadership positions, they are able to effect the cultural change that we want. I mean, that phrase has been used for science. Science advances one funeral at a time. We would still believe that the sun revolves around the earth if the people who believed in them did not die. But eventually things can change because the younger people get older and the older people retire or they die. So I think there's always hope, and to us the approach is always target with our research, what we do is we target the young doctors, we target the young data scientists, we convince them that working together is the only way to go, that the status quo cannot stay because it is very, very prohibitive in terms of our domain moving forward. So to me, start educating the young people, convince them that the culture has to change because they will bring about that change that we want.
I would like to ask.
อาจารย์ค่ะมีค่ะ
I would like to ask your opinion about the cultural exchange by talent mobility program. Do you have not just academic exchange, but also the society exchange, as you have already shown us this last few days about democratizing access, and there are many challenges to improving the quality of life, not just in US, but another part of the world. What is in the mind of the talent in US to work outside US?
we do have a lot of, our lab, for example, we host scientists and doctors from around the world. So we're always eager to host people from other countries to spend. Our suggestion is spend at least 1 year, because less than 1 year, you don't really reap the benefits of that exchange program. Exactly. So, yes. But it takes time for them to understand how we do things. And then what happens now is they learn, and then they go back to the country, and they start becoming the ambassadors of change in those countries, and then they continue the collaboration even after they go back. So a lot of the labs at MIT are like that. We have visiting scientists program that would allow people from our partner organizations, partner universities, partner companies to send people to us, and vice versa.
อาจารย์ขาบัดนี้ได้เวลาอันควรแล้วแต่จริงๆเนี่ย this is not the last, right? This is the beginning. Our journey that we will have collaboration between Khon-Kaen, Thailand, and MIT, Boston, Massachusetts, USA. I think this is a good opportunity. May I, as our culture, Thai culture, may I invite assistant to the president นะคะพี่นุชนะคะอาจารย์นุชนะคะพี่นุชอาจารย์รัชดานะคะ to give a token of appreciation, just a small thing to our 3 speakers ค่ะพี่นุชค่ะJames first. Maybe I should be out of the frame. James, thank you. พี่นุชค่ะเอาเลยค่ะ And Leo. Thank you. And Ken.ทางนี้ใช่ไหมand thank you so much นะคะ for your time to share with us all these great idea and discussion. Thank you, and we continue to, our relationship and collaboration. Thank you ค่ะขอบคุณค่ะ